Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Shadows of infinity, night enveloped the small town in Wisconsin. A thick fog rolled through the streets, swallowing the light from street lamps. On the outskirts, where an old farm had been abandoned for decades, life had returned. But not the kind the locals had been expecting. Marcus and Linda were a young couple who loved extreme thrills. They had heard stories about this farm, about the Graves family who had lived there 100 years ago and mysteriously vanished. Rumors said they had been involved in something horrifying, and that their souls still wandered the area. Marcus laughed at the scary stories, while Linda egged him on for risky adventures. That's why they decided to spend the night in the abandoned house. They left the car by the roadside and, armed with flashlights, ventured into the darkness. The door creaked as Marcus pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, and the smell of mildew hung heavily, as if the air hadn't stirred here for decades. Linda turned on her flashlight and gasped. Old newspaper clippings were pinned to the walls with rusty nails. Serial killers escaped from custody. Their victims remained alive for days after the attack, she read aloud. Marcus shrugged. It's just an old newspaper, don't be scared. But as they moved further in, they saw objects on the table. Children's toys, scissors, dried flowers. And then something even more chilling. Stains on the floor that looked like dried blood. Linda felt her throat tighten. "We're not alone," she whispered. At that moment, a sound came from the basement. Not just a noise, but someone's breathing. Heavy, irregular, like that of a beast. Marcus rushed to the door, but it slammed shut right in front of his face. The lock clicked by itself. Silence. And then a voice. Low, whispering as if from the walls. "You came for a reason." Linda screamed. She thought she saw a face in the window, pale, with empty eyes. Marcus, breathless, tugged at the door again, but it wouldn't budge. At that moment, from the corridor, a figure slowly emerged, as if savoring the situation. A tall man in tattered clothes, his face hidden by a mask resembling cheese. His hands were red, like those of a butcher. Linda felt her heart pounding in her throat. "We need to run," Marcus managed to whisper, before the man lunged at them. Marcus grabbed Linda's hand, and they rushed toward the basement door. Linda's fingers were cold as ice, and her heart was beating so fast it felt like her chest would burst. The basement door was half open, and the darkness on the other side beckoned them like an abyss. They had no choice. They found themselves in a dark corridor underground. The flashlights flickered, and a suffocating smell of decay filled the air. She heard someone following them. It wasn't just heavy breathing, it was something beyond human nature. A dark force was chasing them, like an invisible predator, taking its time, knowing they couldn't escape. "Don't look back," Marcus whispered as Linda turned around, feeling cold sweat gather on her forehead. "We need to find the exit." But then everything went silent. The silence was almost deafening. Linda nearly lost her balance as they passed old furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but their hearts were still pounding like drums. "What was that?" Linda whispered fearfully, clutching Marcus's hand. "I don't know," he replied, his voice sounding foreign, just like these walls. They stopped when they saw two strips of light shining from the front of the basement. The exit. They could escape. But in front of them appeared another figure. This time, a woman. Her face was blurry, as if diseased, with slit lips through which dark liquid was dripping. She stood in the doorway, holding an old brown knife, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the flashlight. "Don't go," she whispered. "You won't find your way back. They are waiting for you." Marcus and Linda didn't have time to think. He grabbed Linda and pulled her toward the exit. But just by the door, they encountered something they couldn't explain. The air grew heavy and bitter, and the walls of the basement started to tremble. Whether it was the earth or the building itself, it began to shake. And then, from the darkness, two figures sprang forward. They were men, their faces wrapped in black cloth, but their eyes burned with fire, like bonfires, and through them, an evil force broke through, one Linda could feel physically. "You won't escape from us," one of them said, his voice shattering the silence like ice. Marcus pulled Linda again, but this time, he failed. One of the figures grabbed him by the shoulder, and in the next moment, Marcus felt something tighten inside him. His heart stopped for a second, and his chest was filled with cold, as though something dark and alien had entered him, something that meant death. Linda screamed when she saw his body helplessly fall to the floor. She rushed to him, but one of the men standing nearby raised his hand, and she felt an invisible force push her back. "You can't just leave here," whispered the other figure, stepping closer. "You've become part of this place." Linda felt her throat tighten. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't allow herself to give in. She had to find a way out. "What do you want from us?" she cried, trying to gather the last bit of courage. "We've been waiting for a long time." "You're the last one who must go through this," said one of them, his voice like a silent command. It felt as though the darkness was closing in around them, swallowing every hope of escape. Linda glanced around once more, and suddenly her eyes fell on one of the doors that was barely ajar at the end of the corridor. It was the only hope. She dashed toward it, not thinking at all. But suddenly, her hand stopped on something wet and cold. She turned around. Before her stood the figure of her greatest fear, a man in black, with the mask of a serial killer, and in his hands, the same knife. Linda froze. Her heart wasn't just pounding, it felt like it was tearing apart from the terror. The man with the serial killer's mask stood so close that she could feel the cold of his breath. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she knew she couldn't just stand there. Otherwise, she would become the next victim. A guttural scream tore from her throat as she stepped back, as if trying to find even the smallest crack in the basement through which she could escape. But it was too late. The masked man took a step forward, and his movements were precise, as though everything had already been decided. Linda clenched her fists and desperately lunged to the side, trying to run through the same door she had rushed toward earlier. But another man stood before her, tall, with his face wrapped in dark fabric, his eyes the only part of him visible. He didn't move, just watched her every move with interest, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the final move. "You won't get out," he muttered, and his voice echoed through the dark corridor. Linda, already ready to surrender to this nightmare, felt her hands tremble. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, and everything began to blur again. She couldn't let herself give in. She had already lost Marcus, and she didn't want his death to be in vain. She had to survive. Suddenly, from the darkness, a loud sound broke through. The door leading to the exit creaked open. It was unnatural. Linda, as if in a trance, moved toward it, forgetting about the men standing behind her. Each step she took echoed in her head, as if she were walking toward certain death. But on the threshold stood another figure. Short, with long hair, wrapped in old towels. She was holding something in her hands, something that couldn't be made out in the darkness. "You shouldn't go there," she said in a faint voice that barely cut through the silence. "It's worse there." Linda couldn't believe her ears. It seemed as if this woman was just like them. Dead. She raised her head, and Linda saw her eyes, full of terror and exhaustion. And then she understood. "You're one of them," Linda whispered, stepping back from the threshold. The woman nodded. "We're all part of this land, and now, you're one of us too. They can't be stopped." Linda felt a chill run through her skin. She was already in their trap. Those who had disappeared, those who had died here so many years ago, they had now become part of this place. She wasn't the first, and certainly wouldn't be the last. In the next moment, the ground beneath her feet trembled. All the figures disappeared into the darkness, and Linda found herself alone. The light from the flashlight began to flicker, and the darkness consumed everything around her. She stood in complete silence. There was nothing beneath her feet, no floor, no walls, only the infinity that was swallowing her soul. And then she realized. Those who came here didn't leave alive. They became part of this place, invisible, but always present. And now her too. Linda could no longer feel her fingers. The darkness welcomed her as one of those who had perished here long ago. And now her face was wrapped in black fabric. Linda felt her body become heavy, as if an invisible weight was crushing her chest. She couldn't breathe, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. The darkness engulfed her completely, But along with it came a relentless, unclear force whispering in her ear. "You won't return," someone behind her whispered, and her heart fluttered with fear. She spun around, trying to find an exit, but everything around her looked the same. Identical walls, identical doors, identical faces that were and weren't. In every corner, she saw silhouettes moving, appearing and disappearing, leaving only a whisper that pulsed in her head. "You're already here, you're with us," a low voice spoke, echoing from every corner of the room. Linda felt an unbearable fear grip her. She began to understand. These figures were not living people. They had become part of this place, just like all who had crossed this threshold. And it seemed Linda had become one of them. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet became unstable, as if the earth beneath her was dissolving. She was falling, like into an abyss. The darkness swallowed her, and when she landed, she found herself lying on the cold stone floor, surrounded by the same figures that had once been her pursuers. But now, they didn't move. Their eyes, full of fire, darkened. They no longer looked at her with aggression, but as if she was part of this dreadful place, as if she had become one of them. "Can you see?" A voice echoed, the same woman who had spoken to her earlier. "You're no longer human. You are part of this madness." Her voice was calm, but Linda could sense something terrifying in it, something supernatural. Linda, struggling not to give in, stood up, but her eyes couldn't look away from one of the figures. For a moment, it seemed like she saw familiar features. Marcus. But it was an illusion. His face was distorted, like a doll cast into the abyss of time. There was no life in his eyes anymore. "He's no longer yours," a raspy voice said behind her, and Linda felt her heart flutter again, as if she had been hit with a wave of pain. Not long ago, they had laughed together, and now he was nothing but part of this place. "Marcus!" Linda screamed, but her voice was drowned by the unpleasant silence that surrounded her. Suddenly, a crack opened in one of the walls, and unnatural light began to pour out. This light was discordant, cold, and foul-smelling, as if it was filled with empty souls. And from this light, silhouettes began to appear, more than just figures. These were shadows filled with endless pain and horror. They had no faces, but their movements were sharp and cruel. Every movement echoed like a strike on nerve fibers. "They're coming for you," the voice said, and Linda realized that this wasn't just an illusion. She could feel their steps through the walls. They were already here, and there was no way back. With blurred vision, Linda saw one of the figures. It looked like a human body, but everything was wrong. The skin was torn, and black liquid was dripping from its empty eyes. This was not a person. It was death itself, brought to life and malevolent. It didn't move, but in its gaze, there was everything. Pain, anger, wrath. Linda froze when she noticed how her hands began to change. The skin started to decay, like old film peeling off her flesh. She screamed, but she couldn't hear her own voice because it drowned in the chaos, in the darkness. And in that moment, the darkness pressed her into itself, transforming her into yet another part of this world. Her body became part of the walls, part of a statue that didn't move, only waiting for new victims. She was no longer human. She had become part of this cursed land that would never be free from the shadows that surrounded it. And everything around her fell silent again. When Linda felt her body slowly absorbing the darkness, she knew she could no longer return. It wasn't just death, it was a transformation. Her consciousness no longer belonged to her. She had become part of something greater, something dark and endless. Her body no longer obeyed her will. Every cell, every nerve was entwined with boundless darkness that dragged her down into the very depths of this place. But the scariest part was that her mind didn't perish. She could feel her essence dissolving in the darkness, transforming into something new, and that new thing was terrifying and unstoppable. Her former self gradually disappeared, leaving only emptiness and a craving. The desire to hunt, the desire to kill, the desire to devour everything in its path. She had become one of them, one of the shadows of this place. She was no longer human. She had become a creature that was part of this hellish world. The darkness dragged her deeper into the basement. Linda could no longer see, but she felt her consciousness being pulled into the void. She was a witness to how all those who had come here became part of her. And among them, Marcus. His face was no longer alive, but she could still sense his presence. He was hers, but no longer was. He had become one of those very shadows they had pursued. And now, along with the other souls, he waited for his turn to become yet another element in this endless game. Linda felt her body grow larger, rusting, as if her skin had spread out into the darkness. She was transforming into what everyone feared who dared to enter here. A shadow that moves on its own, invisible yet palpable. She had become part of those very creatures that stalk anyone who crosses the threshold of this place. But her face remained, though deformed. She no longer looked like the woman Marcus had remembered. She had become something bigger and more terrifying. Her eyes no longer had human features. They were black, bottomless, with a gleam of merciless darkness. She could no longer feel pain. Only desire, the unrelenting desire to penetrate others, to absorb their souls to become even stronger. And now, when she emerged from the darkness, she saw her, another soul, yet another victim of this place. A young man, his eyes wide open and his face twisted with utter despair, stood before her, not understanding what was happening. He had already felt them, but he couldn't see. Like all who came before him, he was almost dead, with only a few seconds left before he became part of this soulless place. And Linda, or whatever was left of Linda, looked at him. "You won't escape," she whispered, not even realizing that her voice had changed, becoming different, foreign. It sounded like 1,000 voices, merged into one bottomless void. He took a few steps back, but it didn't matter. With each step, with every movement, the darkness followed him. It was her, Linda, but no longer in a body, but in essence in shadow. And all that was left for the man was to feel her absorb him, to feel his life turn into part of this place. His scream made no sound. Linda no longer heard screams. They didn't matter. She was no more. Now, she was only part of this endless darkness, which absorbed all souls that settled in this dreadful place. She had become a shadow that haunts everyone who dares to cross the threshold. And though the body remained dead, the soul no longer belonged to him. It had become a faceless entity that would trap the next innocent souls in its snare. Linda was no longer human. She had become the embodiment of this place. The embodiment of horror that never ends, that always waits to devour the next victim. And now, when the light went out, the shadows grew even darker. And Linda, or whatever dark essence was left, began whispering again, seeking new souls for this endless circle. Linda, or what had already become her shadow, stood on the edge, watching as the new victim, a young man with wide open eyes, unable to believe what was happening to him, began to understand what was happening. In his eyes reflected hopelessness, but his body had no strength to move. And she knew, this was her last victim, the last soul that would become part of this place. She no longer felt human emotions. Her body no longer obeyed her will. She was pure darkness, carrying with it death. But something inside, the remnants of what once was Linda, longed to witness this moment. She desired to see him realize that nothing would remain of him, that he too would become one of those ghosts, forgotten and consumed by this endless void. The man sprang to his feet, trying to escape, but again and again he fell. The darkness swallowed him, and every move he made only bound him more. He could not run, he could not hide. The shadow would not let him go. And then, when he fell to the floor, his eyes saw the last thing he would ever see. Linda, no longer alive, no longer a woman. In her eyes reflected an endless emptiness. Her body vanished, transforming into an invisible spirit that latched onto anyone who crossed this threshold. And then, with his final step, he realized that he hadn't just walked into a trap. He had become part of it. His body was no longer his. His soul was already empty. But this was not the end. It was a new beginning for him. From the moment he entered this place, he was no longer who he had been. He had become one of the shadows wandering in the darkness, just as all the others had. The room began to crumble, breaking into pieces, and every object vanished again into the darkness, leaving only the sounds of never-ending footsteps. The darkness consumed everything, and only the relentless whisper remained, like millions of souls paying for their sins. Linda was no longer human, and no one in this place was alive. It was a world where time didn't exist. It was an endless trap, where even death was only the beginning. And each time a new soul appeared, it became another element of this unstoppable cycle that had no end. Only whispers, only darkness, and endless shadows. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.